Ah yes, welcome to Chrontendo episode 9. We're going all the way back to summer of 1986. Nintendo of America is busy promoting its still relatively new Nintendo Entertainment System, and they will release one game, Gumshoe, in the United States that was never released in Japan. However, in July of 1986, Sega releases its Sega Master System in the US as well, thus extending the Nintendo-Sega rivalry to the US. Well, this episode will see Hudson Soft release a great shoot-'em-up for the Famicom. Konami will continue to release some pretty good games for the Famicom, and Namco will step up to the plate with a rather Zelda-esque RPG game. And finally, we'll see 3 original games from Nintendo themselves, which is an unusual occurrence at this point in the Famicom's lifespan. And our first game this episode is Data Eat's B-Wings, and this is a vertical shoot-'em-up. This is a port of Data East's 1984 arcade game, and they've actually added some things for this Famicom version. For example, you can actually select from quite a wide variety of power-ups here at the very beginning. Some of these are quite a bit more useful than others, as you can imagine. Throughout the game, you'll have the opportunity to change power-ups occasionally, and if you get hit, you can actually lose your power-up and be stuck with the rather lame laser cannon that's the default. This is the arcade version right here. Not bad music on the arcade version. I actually haven't received any power-ups yet. You start off with nothing at all. You have to shoot them down and collect them later, as is standard for most shooters. The whole idea of choosing your power-up at the beginning is interesting, but the execution on this game doesn't really quite pull it off very well. This actually reminds me a lot of Argus, with all these various sorts of floating objects here that you have to either blow up or get out of the way. Some power-ups are more useful than others, as I mentioned. Sometimes it'll sort of give you a hint by giving you a power-up that will actually come in very useful in the next section. For example, here all these little tiny things kind of come flying at you, and this thing, which sort of shoots off very short rays in all directions, will help you get through this next section here. This was the first game that Data East themselves released for the Famicom. Some of their other games had come out by other publishers, such as Burger Time, for example. But they would end up becoming a reasonably prolific creator of Famicom games. They would release a lot in the United States as well. They had some US-only titles, so we'll be seeing the name Data East quite a bit from now on. Here I have the fire power-up, which is pretty useful for dealing with this boss, as well as all the missiles that come at you. Sort of a shame that the first game on this episode is still mediocre, but oddly enough, the next game we'll be looking at, Star Soldier, is also a shoot-'em-up, and it's substantially better than this one. In fact, I'd say it's probably really about the first, one of the best shooters on the Famicom so far, maybe not the best. So here we are, sort of finishing off the boss. Hope you're not expecting a big explosion or something like that. Looks like he just lost power. So yeah, it's pretty much your average typical shoot-'em-up of this era. And oddly enough, our second game this episode is also a shoot-'em-up. Star Soldier by Hudson Soft. And as it turns out, this game is vastly superior to B-Wings. In fact, I would probably go so far as to say this is actually the best original shooter for the Famicom yet. Star Soldier is sort of theoretically a sequel to Star Force, even though that game was not actually designed by Hudson. And of course this game would have later sequels as well, which are quite well known, such as Super Star Soldier and Soldier Blade. Star Soldier really does seem to embody a lot of the elements that make up a good shooter, at least a good console shooter. For example, you have a variety of power-ups, including, well, you see where there we can fire both forwards and backwards. Later you get like more of like a spread shot that goes all around you, as well as shields. Occasionally you'll get a power-up that will explode everything on the screen. And of course you have a wide variety of enemies and lots of things to shoot at and lots of ways to get extra points. Here's one of the bosses. Actually, it's really not bad looking for a game of this vintage. Oddly enough, there is a timer on the bosses. If you don't defeat them within 30 seconds, you actually have to do the entire level again. Of course, some people might find this to be pretty frustrating. And also, there are numerous hidden items as well in Star Soldier. Occasionally you'll be shooting and uncover something, that a letter shape that will give you some kind of power-up or bonus points. We'll actually see a couple of these during the gameplay video. It's hard to say what makes this game so much better than a lot of the other shooters we've seen. Ah, there's a Z right there. I missed picking it up, but you could see it right as I hit it just a little bit too late. Okay, here is the spread shot here, and here is the big boss that appears every so many levels. He's actually relatively hard, and quite frankly, the spread shot is not quite as effective in taking him out, or taking the bosses out, as the straight ahead fire is. If you get hit a couple times though, you'll be reduced down to the double fire, which is much more effective for taking out bosses. Well, unlike a lot of those older games, Star Soldier just feels right. It has a lot of firepower, a lot of things to shoot, lots of different kinds of enemies, sort of strange things appear like the eyeballs and whatnot. One thing that might take a bit of getting used to is the fact that you can go both above and below the various floating platforms in space. Not everyone seems to understand this. I was reading, I think, one mention of this game, and they actually thought that was like a problem in the emulation, but you can actually control it by pressing up or down right before you pass something. Going underneath platforms can actually be very helpful. Sometimes there are areas where there's pretty heavy enemies, ones that like move very fast, for example, and difficult to dodge. If you just go underneath the platform right before that particular enemy appears, you'll find it to be quite helpful. So all in all, I'd say that Star Soldier is a great game, perhaps the best shooter on the Famicom other than Gradius. And this is certainly Hudson Soft taking perhaps the first steps in becoming one of the best shooter developers on the consoles. The other one, of course, being Compile. But this is certainly kind of where it all started for Hudson Soft. Released the same day as Star Soldier is Capcom's Makiamura, or Demon Village, known in the United States as Ghosts and Goblins. The game opens with the infamous cutscene of Arthur lounging in the graveyard with his girlfriend, Princess Prin Prin, in his underwear. What exactly is going on here, we'll never know. When Prin Prin is kidnapped by a demon, it's up to Arthur to traverse the demon village and get her back. Here's the original arcade version right here. So what needs to be said about Ghosts and Goblins? It's an all-time classic, that's for sure, one of the games along with Commando in 1942 that put Capcom on the map. The game was designed by Tokuro Fujiwara, the same guy who developed Commando and Mega Man. When Ghosts and Goblins hit the arcades in 1985, it immediately made gamers take notice, not only for its great graphics, but also the game's sense of style and humor. Perhaps more than anything else, the game had really cool level design and character design and animation. Not to mention it was incredibly hard. If by some chance you managed to make it all the way to the last level, you would find yourselves transported back to the beginning of the game and have to go through the whole thing again in order to get to the ending. The game was quite a hit, and was converted to a number of different systems. When this one came out in 1986, it was almost certainly the best looking Ghosts and Goblins at this time. Of course, how does it compare nowadays? Well, the graphics are pretty ugly. In terms of the gameplay, well, once again this game was ported by Micronix. the same company who did 1942, XX's Sun Sun, and a few other disastrous Capcom conversions. While this version does look a lot like the arcade version, it actually plays a bit differently. For example, this guy is harder in the Famicom version than in the arcade version. Why would they want to make the game harder, I wonder? The game just does not control nearly as well as the arcade version, just sort of feels a little bit weird. Technically, the game does not look nearly as bad as some other Micronix titles, but certainly there would be better versions of this released in the future. And this game actually sounds pretty decent. Ghosts and Goblins' famous theme music actually makes it pretty much intact here. Much better than the horrible, annoying rat-a-tat-tat soundtrack of Micronix's 1942. So I guess we can say about this Famicom Ghosts and Goblins, it's certainly the best thing we had at the time. The game is actually more difficult, the controls are a little stiff. Just feels a little weird playing it. There is some sprite flicker, but not really too much slowdown. I guess the bottom line is that in 1985, Ghosts and Goblins was a state-of-the-art arcade game, something that the Famicom simply could not reproduce accurately. On the plus side, this I believe is actually the last game that Capcom hired Micronix to port. In the future they'll be doing all their Famicom versions themselves, with hopefully much better results. And this is Super Chinese, a game with a incredibly strange name, thankfully changed to Kung Fu Heroes for the US release. Not to mention a very annoying soundtrack and sound effects. This guy is supposedly some kind of Kung Fu master, but why is he always making noises like a barking dog? Well, this game was published by Namco, but was actually developed by a company called Nihon Game. However, in the credits, they refer to themselves as Micro Academy, and later they would change their name to the even worse Culture Brain. I guess they had a thing for really weird-sounding names. There were a couple sequels to Super Chinese, and they were all actually quite a bit different. They sort of went more in an RPG game mode a little bit later in the series. Well, let's take a look at this very first game here. You play this sort of Kung Fu master dude, you wander around and you beat up people. This game is simply a series of single-screen levels. The object of each screen is to keep killing people until there's a certain number of people you have to kill, then you exit the screen and go on to the next one. Occasionally you will bust up in a rock and find a secret passageway to a bonus level, which we saw just a second ago. You have a few different attacks. You can punch, you can do a very handy little flip jump. I've just completed the first level here, as you can see. And the game is actually done sort of in a very strange kind of top-down but three-quarters view. One thing about this game is the hit detection is a little weird. There's a lot of times when it looks like I'm actually hitting something, but I'm not. Well, occasionally this guy will come along. If he does appear, I wouldn't advise you try to fight him. Just run and hide, because he'll kill you pretty easily. And then the level resumes to normal. This game actually does have a few very minor RPG elements. You see the little fist up at the top there? That's kind of like your strength. If you need to really sort of need to keep busting open blocks and try to find various little sort of power-ups. Some are temporary, but others will actually permanently increase your strength. In fact, in this level, you need to be a strength of 3 in order to kill the various enemies walking around. These guys wearing buffalo hats for some reason. Luckily, I just found a power-up. Now I'm able to dispose of them with my fists. So this game does play a little strangely. It sort of feels weird. As I mentioned, the hit detection seems very strange at times. It is a bit of a repetitive game. Occasionally you'll get like another kind of power up there, like there's like little fireballs you can throw. You can also collect those little E icons and do like some kind of like super kick, which I actually don't really find very useful. Culture Brain eventually released this game in the United States themselves in 1989, by which time it must have seemed impossibly old-fashioned. They would go on to create better games. This next game is Sqoon, and right away take a look at this title screen. There's a topless mermaid holding a glowing crucifix. How exactly did this one slip past Nintendo's censors, I wonder? This game was published by Irem, but actually developed by a company called Home Data, same guys who did Penguin Coon Wars. And while that game was pretty fun, I find this game to be not fun at all. It's very similar to Choplifter of all things, which is kind of odd because Choplifter was released for the NES on the same day as this. Oh, by the way, right away if you move your ship over the cross, you can get a extra life. So the story here is that Neptunians have invaded Earth and have caused all the oceans to rise, and it's your job to save mankind. And quite frankly, looking at the state of New York City there, I'd say it's probably maybe a little too late. Now, I don't know what's going on with the hit text in this game, but I've looked at that little sequence there when I tried to bomb that little prison, and I saw my missiles go right through that prison several times, and it did not register a hit. Something about this game is just weird. I don't know. I just can't stand playing it. Maybe it's the annoying enemies, maybe it's the way that whenever you go down to bomb a base, suddenly a huge wave of enemies comes to hit you. The object is really just like Choplifter or maybe Defender. Move along, kill everybody. When you come across some prisoners being held in little underwater bases, bomb it, grab them before the sharks eat them, and then take them to the little floating island up ahead. You have a fuel gauge which gets refueled whenever you bring prisoners into the little floating island. I don't know, it's just everything about this game sort of screams, you know, they didn't really put a whole lot of effort into it. I've tried playing it for a little bit, but just, I don't know, I just could not get into this game. Maybe other folks will have better results. I really don't know. Let me tell you, the fact that Irem has released this game and Spelunker really makes me not have too much respect for them based on the stuff they've released for the Famicom so far. Well, we have another historical moment coming up here. This game is Gumshoe. Take a moment to read the Spartan X-like letter. This is another kidnapped girl type game. The objects to find these 5 diamonds called the Black Panthers. Now what makes this game unique and historically interesting is that this is the first game that has only been released for the NES, not for the Famicom. This was released in the United States in June of 1986, never released in Japan, and while the Famicom has had the release dates, the exact release dates documented very well, this isn't really the case with the American NES. So when we're looking at US only games, I got the first of the diamond right there. When we're looking at US only games, we'll usually only have the month and the year, not the actual date. Why was this game not released in Japan? Well, remember that Nintendo was trying to use the existence of the Zapper to help sell the new NES system, and I think they simply needed more Zapper games. In Japan, I think they had pretty much given up on the whole light gun idea, but in the US it was still a major selling point. And of course, remember at this time, there were really not that many games available for the NES in the United States, while there were plenty available in Japan, so I guess Japan simply didn't need this game. Well, how do you play it? Well, you don't control this guy directly. He simply walks along in a straight line and use the gun to either shoot him and get him to hop up in the air, or to shoot projectiles coming towards him. Shooting the bird will give you some kind of power. In this case, when your overcoat is pink, he can take one hit before dying. What you want to watch out for are things like birds, flying bottles, cars, bombs, those little skull things. Colliding with one of those will kill your guy. In this case, because I had the pink overcoat, I was able to survive one hit. Once you get to the end of the level, you will find some sort of, well, in this case it's an elevator, to take you on to the next level. And then of course we've got to find, well, I guess we've gotten 2 so far. We've got to keep finding those damn diamonds. So sort of a fun little game, a little different. Kind of reminds you of the can shooting thing in Hogan's Alley, only the entire game. Perhaps not the best light gun game on the NES, but it certainly could be a lot worse. From Jalico we have Choplifter, and yes, this is a port of the antique American PC game, originally from 1982 in the Apple II computer. We've definitely seen some old Apple games be ported to the Famicom at this point, but why they chose to do this particular game I really don't know. It was quite popular when it first came out, but it had already been ported to pretty much every single system you could possibly think of. Honestly, I think by 1986 even Slide Rules had this game ported to it. The object, if you're really not familiar with this game, is very much like Defender. You fly a helicopter, go around, blow stuff up, and try to rescue the hostages. Yes, this game is not merely about mass murder. The only reason you're actually killing people is because you want to rescue those hostages, which are being held captive in some unknown desert nation. The controls of Choplifter are a little bit weird. You use your D-pad to move up and down and then move from side to side. But you actually have to use the B button, I believe it is, to turn your helicopter around. Hitting the B button once will turn it a 90-degree angle. So once you've got the first batch of hostages safe and sound, go out and do it again. While I guess this game seemed pretty impressive in its day, I don't really think it had aged that well in 1986, much less in 2008. The shooting is pretty simple, and quite frankly you can avoid a lot of the gunfire simply by flying at the top. Occasionally you have to do a little bit of dodging and swerving. Not to say the game is really easy. The fact that your airplane, or rather your helicopter, controls so slowly makes the game a little frustrating, quite frankly. I guess just compared to the kind of shooters that were coming out at this time, which is the greatest, this game just seemed absurdly old-fashioned. And really not too terribly fun to play, but you never know, maybe you'll have some fun with it. Me, I personally don't really care for this game. If they're releasing games like this for the Famicom, then what's next? A port of Oregon Trail? This game is from Sunsoft, and the title is usually known as Toukaidou Gojuusan, though the actual title, as you see here, is a bit longer. In this game, you play a fireworks maker who for some reason has to journey from Kyoto to Edo. And along the way, you will naturally encounter a lot of ninjas. This first level here is just sort of an introductory level. As a fireworks maker, your weapon of choice is little explosive bombs. And as you can see, since the bombs travel in an arc when you throw them, they can be rather hard to hit an enemy. Probably the best strategy is to actually jump while you're throwing the bomb. Or you can try throwing a bomb right before an enemy touches you. So once you get past this very short little level here, you move on to the real game. And this game is actually based on the 53 stages of the Toukaidou, which is a major Japanese road that's been around for quite some time, which links Edo and Kyoto. In Japan, this road and its various stations are quite well known, so the game's title would have quite a bit of cultural significance for a Japanese gamer, not so much for Americans. As you can see, this is a pretty simple jump and throw stuff kind of platformer. That guy actually has a gun, so it's best to avoid him. Occasionally you'll have to jump over a river or something like that. This game actually only has 21 stages, so apparently not every single stopping point along the Toukaidou Road is actually covered in this game. What we're looking at here is actually an unofficial English translation, just so we can sort of read the between level intertitles. Not really sure who developed this game, if it was Sunsoft or if they used an outside developer. It's not exactly bad, but it's not exactly exciting either. It's pretty much a standard platformer for the time. I believe this is not actually an enemy, rather a woman, perhaps a prostitute, who sort of latches herself onto you. Oddly enough, there's a very similar type character in the game Iki, which we saw earlier. A little later you'll see like a female ghost that chases after you and probably wants to do something similar. While playing this game you will occasionally collect gold coins or various other objects, but I haven't really figured out what exactly they're for. I will admit there are certain elements of this game which are still a mystery to me. If you take a bit more time playing it, sort of looking into it, you might get a bit more out of it than I did. For some reason we have a lot of puzzle games this episode, and this is the first one, Tower of Babel, or just Babel as the screen says, or Tao no Babel as it's usually referred to in Japanese. This is a game in which you move around little pieces of staircases and try to get to the exit. This first level is actually more difficult than it looks. It involves a little trick of climbing over one staircase and then grabbing it from the other end. Something that's actually not immediately obvious when you're playing this game. Various little bonus items will appear from time to time. This game was developed by Namco, and it's reasonably long. There are 64 levels altogether, and as you can imagine they get quite difficult by the end. This game falls into a category that I tend to call Soukoban type games. Soukoban is an earlier Japanese computer puzzle game, and it seems to have inspired a lot of sort of similar ideas, such as this one. As a rule, Soukoban type games usually involve moving around some sort of blocks or similar objects, trying to clear passages and move things around, and usually there's some kind of physical obstructions that keep you from moving anywhere. Like in this case, it's for example, well, gravity is sort of an obstruction, as well as the various stairways and vines. And there's usually some sort of rule as to how you can or cannot move things. In Soukoban itself, you can push but not pull cartons. In this particular, I died there, you cannot jump off a ledge while holding a block because it'll crush you. In this particular game, you can only climb the stairs from one direction. In this level, there's actually that sort of a little monster face there that you have to get rid of by touching the light switch. So you need to first build a staircase to the light switch, and then after that's taken care of, you can exit the little hole there when the monster face disappears. This game does eventually bring in moving enemies. Now there's no timer on this, but you do have power. Basically your power goes down one every time you lift a block. So you only have a finite number of lifts. Here's the first level with the moving enemy. Well, I've made a terrible mistake there, and there's really no way to avoid him once he gets you in a corner like that. You can crush an enemy by dropping a block on his head. I'll try that the second time here. Now one thing about the later levels is these levels we're looking at here basically all exist simply on one screen. The later levels are much longer. In fact, you can never see the entire thing on one screen, so this makes it kind of difficult because you won't always know what's above or below you. Therefore, you sort of have to move around the screen, plan your course of action, and once you sort of explore the whole thing, then try to figure out how to get through. You will probably lose a couple lives doing this. Well, here's a good example right here. I saw if I could drop a staircase down there. Well, unfortunately, when I go down to see what's down below there, I find there's nothing but a bunch of spikes. This is one of those where the solution is sort of hidden in plain sight. So if you're a fan of puzzle games like this, I'd certainly recommend giving this a try. Looks pretty nice, probably more engaging than Flappy, which is an earlier Soukoban type puzzle game. And we'll see a couple more of these things a little later on in the episode. This is the fourth release for the Nintendo Famicom Disk System, Volleyball, published by Nintendo themselves, though this is one of those unusual instances where they actually used an outside developer, a company called Pax Softnica. They would become almost like a second-party developer for Nintendo, would make quite a few games, such as, Mother is one of the most well-known ones. So you select either the easy mode, the training mode, or the real game mode. You also choose whether you want to play the female or the male version. With the female teams, the ball moves a little bit slower, so it's a little easier. When your team members go red, that means they're activated, and those are the team members that you're moving when you use your D-pad. Basically, it selects the team members closest to the ball. This is a reasonably cute little game. Nintendo seems to sort of be following a pattern here of releasing sort of major games, alternating with games like this that probably didn't take as long to develop, and perhaps, well, a lot of them are actually sports titles. They actually have another big game coming up later this episode, which we'll be seeing very soon. I'm not a real big fan of this game. It kind of reminds me of Nintendo Tennis, just on a slightly larger scale. Here is the screen where you select your gender and which team you want to be. The team selection will determine the difficulty of the game. Volleyball definitely takes some getting used to. In order to do well at all outside of the training mode, you'll have to learn how to spike the ball. This requires having one person sort of toss it up in the air, another person run beneath it, jump up, and then spike it. This is actually a bit trickier than it sounds, and I was sort of practicing for a little bit, never really got the hang of it very good. Also note that in the actual game modes, as opposed to training modes, the other team will spike the ball almost all the time. You see it right there, and it's actually quite difficult to defend against a spike, simply because it comes down so fast. So I've never really mastered this game, or didn't even really came close, to tell you the truth. It's not that bad on the training mode, but get to the actual game mode with like a more difficult team, and you'll find yourselves pretty much constantly being hit with spikes, and the only way you're really going to be able to score points against the other team is by learning how to master the spike yourself. So you'll really need to practice at this game if you want to have any fun at it. So once again, we have a new title from Konami, and just like Goonies, this one is also an original created especially for the Famicom. This is Ganbare Goemon. Now, this game is probably not familiar to most folks in the West, but this is actually the first game in a long-running series by Konami. Ganbare Goemon games have been released on many systems, the most recent being the Nintendo DS. The Goemon character in this game is actually based on a historical person, Ishikawa Goemon. He was a 16th century Japanese thief, supposedly a sort of Robin Hood-like character. He was apparently executed by being boiled alive in hot oil, and Japan has a kind of bathtub, a Goemon burrow named after him. The first game in this series was actually an arcade game called Mr. Goemon. It was a side-scrolling beat-em-up, as you can see here. Very little like this game on the Famicom. The only title to be released in the West is Legend of Mystical Ninja, which is a reworking of the first Goemon game for the Super Famicom. Since the first Ganbare Goemon game was never released in the US, we'll take a look at an unofficial English translation to make things a little easier. What sort of game is this? Well, I guess you might say it's a side-scrolling platform game combined with elements of Zelda. Each level consists of several interconnected streets. Sometimes they take place in a city, sometimes they take place outdoors. I've just found a hidden passage there. There's numerous hidden passages concealed in every level. Finding these passages is very important because they always have very helpful items concealed in them. For example, the pass. You actually need to collect 3 of these passes to complete the level. Also, every level contains a shop which you can use to enter a special maze. There will always be 1 pass, as well as some bonus points hidden in the maze. These are first-person mazes, but luckily they're not too annoying, and you can find a map somewhere in the maze without too much difficulty. Ah, there's the map right there. This first maze is actually quite simple. So once you've found the pass you want to go ahead, make sure you didn't miss any bonus items and head on out. Now if you can't find all the passes, you can buy them in shops. You can also buy other helpful items such as armor, healing items, all kinds of things in the shops. So you can definitely see this game owes a certain amount to Zelda. Such it is as the shops to go in to buy items, the fact that you're always collecting money. In this case you collect money by jumping over or near the various little pots scattered around the level. The enemies don't drop any money. Other things you can find in the pots, or items that'll sort of speed you up, and the little lucky cat thing will allow you to have a slingshot, as opposed to your standard issue weapon, which is a pipe. You'll encounter various enemies throughout the game: policemen, thieves, samurais, ninjas of course, and even Japanese demons. I've got my 3 passes, so now I head to the end of the level, and I'm off to the next level. Of course, I've got to celebrate by spreading money among the common people first. As I mentioned, the historical Goemon was supposedly a Robin Hood type guy who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. This guy doesn't actually rob anybody, he mostly just finds money laying around in the streets. Some of the levels here actually involve a bit more platforming type stuff, like this one has falling rocks. There's another hidden passage. You can buy candles, which will allow you to find the hidden passages easier, but of course the candles are quite expensive. There's a healing item. The platforming elements in this game are very light. The city levels don't actually involve any platforming at all, and the levels that do have some platforming are usually pretty simple. Probably the most annoying are levels which take place at sea. There will always be some point where you have to jump over a bunch of little islands. Here's one of the sea levels right here. There's a little bonus item, a Konami Easter Island style head there. Most of the challenge of this game is avoiding the enemies and making sure you find all the necessary items before the timer runs out. The levels aren't usually too large. At most, usually the early ones are around 2, 3, 4 levels high, and then, a number of screens across. Oh, here's some of the island hopping I was talking about. You can't really control how far you jump, so you sort of have to gauge the jumps very, very carefully. So this game is pretty interesting in like a Zelda Light, Super Mario Bros. Light kind of style. The later games in this series were quite different. They actually started developing a very unusual sense of humor and became much stranger. If you've ever played Legend of the Mystical Ninja, you'll know what I mean. Regardless, the first Ganbare Goemon game is still pretty interesting. Well, right away on this game, we see the title screen violates Nintendo USA's prohibition of religious symbols. There's a Star of David clearly seen there. Yes, this is Solomon no Kagi, a port of Timco's 1986 arcade game. This was still a relatively recent game when the Famicom version came out. I believe the arcade version was a pretty reasonable hit. This thing was ported to many systems. As you can see, it's actually quite nice looking. Take a look at those dragons in the background there. Just like Timco's Mighty Bomb Jack, this game was eventually released in the West as well. Obviously the Famicom version can't quite live up to the arcade version, but it's still a reasonably fun game to play. Well, the object here is apparently you are this little wizard fellow who is invading the actual tomb of Solomon himself in order to obtain Solomon's key. You have to find your way through, is it 64 or 65 levels? Each one you have to find a key which will open up the door, and then you must escape without being killed by any of the enemies. There's also countless little hidden things here, as well as a bell on every level that you can collect. If you hit that, a little fairy will come out, and collecting the fairy will give you a fireball. Since you don't normally have any sort of offensive weapons, the fireball is quite useful. How you actually get around is the sort of tan colored or brownish red orangish blocks. Those can be destroyed using your magic wand. You can also use your magic wand to create blocks. Thus you can sort of create little step ladders, destroy blocks that are in your way. The gray blocks are mostly indestructible, but occasionally there are sort of secret gray blocks that can be destroyed. As you progress through the levels, the enemies get consistently more and more difficult, and you have to be quite clever to avoid them and to make your way to the key without being killed. Here I've sort of accidentally trapped myself. Well, I suppose I actually could have gotten out of that, but here I'll try a slightly better attempt at getting through this level. This game almost reminds me a little bit of Soukoban type games in the sense that you're sort of, rather than moving blocks around, you're destroying them and creating them. But the idea is sort of similar. But I suppose that really the game this resembles most is Lode Runner. Instead of digging little holes, you can destroy blocks that your enemies can fall into. And like Lode Runner, this game is hard. Luckily you can jump up one space. That makes the game a bit easier. These first few levels are pretty simple, but the game actually ramps up in difficulty pretty quickly, and when it comes right down to it, Solomon's Key is actually a pretty difficult game. So if you have the patience to get through these Lode Runner type games, you actually might enjoy this one quite a bit. For folks who don't like these puzzle type games, you'll probably be pulling your hair out pretty quickly on this one. So the third and final puzzle game we'll be seeing this episode is Soukoban itself, or rather Namida no Soukoban Special, which means something along the lines of Tears of the Soukoban Special. Soukoban itself actually means something like shopkeeper or warehouse worker. Special here is intended to indicate that this is a updated version of the game. And please note, this is a Famicom disk system game, coming out just 1 week after Volleyball. That must certainly be a first for the FDS. Furthermore, this is actually the first non-Nintendo FDS title. This is released by ASCII. And I suppose this game is something of a turning point for the FDS. After this, games will be released on a regular basis by all kinds of publishers, as opposed to just one Nintendo title coming out every month. There will actually be a lot of FDS games released during the rest of the year, probably about 24 or so at least. So how do you actually play this game? Well, basically there's a series of single screen levels. You play the little guy who works in the warehouse who pushes around the packages, or the boxes, or whatever you want to call those things. You can actually hit the select button to get a better view of the screen, as opposed to the excruciatingly small screen that is the default. And the object is to get all the boxes lined up on those little dots. You can push a box, but you can't pull it. And of course it's quite easy to get yourself trapped. Now occasionally you'll hit it like a special item, like I just got a magnet a moment ago. Earlier I believe I picked up what might be a ball of thread. These can be used one time and give you some sort of special ability, like the magnet will pull a box towards you. The thread, or whatever it is, will actually allow you to grab a hold of a box and move it around in different directions. As you can see, there's sort of a timer. There's a score which consistently goes down the longer you play. Now if you're thinking, hey wait a second, I can just put the game on pause and then examine the playing field and figure out how to do it, well no you can't. Hitting the start button will actually quit the game, or rather quit the level. With Namida no Soukoban Special, I suppose if you like these kind of games, you like these little puzzle games that involve moving something around, you'll probably like this. It's reasonably fun, reasonably addictive. There's quite a few levels, I'm not sure exactly how many, but more than enough to keep you occupied for quite some time. So puzzle game fans should take a look at this one. The first release in August is Valkyrie no Bouken. The full title of this in English would be Valkyrie's Adventure, The Legend of the Key of Time. And this is one of the few games that asks you to enter in your zodiac sign and blood type. Valkyrie no Bouken is sort of intriguing because this is perhaps the very first obvious Zelda clone. Remember that Zelda had come out in February, this game was released in August. However, while this game does take a lot of elements from Zelda, it also borrows a lot from RPGs, even American computer RPGs. So what I'm going to do here is sort of break down the ways this game takes items from Zelda and the way that it takes items from existing Famicom or Japanese RPGs and sort of compare and contrast. This game is actually sort of midway between Zelda and an RPG like Hydlide. First of all, you roam the overworld, occasionally running into dungeons, just like Zelda, or Hydlide for that matter, and you can find scattered throughout the world more powerful swords, weaponry, that sort of thing. Just like in Zelda, you have healing items, including red and blue healing items. That thing, by the way, that little beaker, is actually a poison antidote. And just like Zelda, this game revolves around some sort of magical MacGuffin called the Key of Time. Apparently the main villain of this game actually came out of a giant grandfather clock, and you've got to use the Key of Time to put him back in, because he's terrorizing the land. And like Zelda, this game has no dialogue boxes at all. The combat system of this game is very much like Zelda. Monsters appear as you move into an area, and you use your button to swing your sword and hit them. Ah, there's a health potion I received right there. However, the combat is quite a bit more difficult than in Zelda. Your weapons don't have any sort of ranged attack, and the monsters tend to appear surrounding you completely and then converge upon you pretty quickly. This is especially annoying when monsters shoot fireballs. Whereas in Zelda you were usually able to dispatch monsters one at a time, here they tend to gang up on you. In addition to the Zelda-like elements, this game also has a few things that people who have played Dragon Quest or Hydlide might find somewhat familiar. For example, it has inns and shops. There you have the inn, which I'm entering right now. This game is a little unusual in the sense that you can level up only while resting in bed. You accumulate experience points, and then once you hop into the inn, heal yourself and rest, you will then level up. As you saw there, this game does have experience points, hit points, and magic points, much like Hydlide and Dragon Quest and most RPGs. Additionally, you'll find that this game has treasure chests, and much like Dragon Quest, you will sometimes need a key to open them. Another RPG-esque feature is that you can sometimes make extra cash by finding items in treasure chests and then selling them at the shop. Here, if you go to the far left, you can choose an item to sell. For example, I bought a long sword, now I'm selling my short sword. And a lot of the items can actually be found both in shops and hidden treasure chests as well. Valkyrie no Bouken also has a continent-style world, much like Dragon Quest. Unlike Zelda, where you can get to the final castle, or the final dungeon, as soon as you start the game if you really want to, you cannot immediately access the continent where the main villain lives. You'll need to find a ship and a whale in order to get there, which takes some time. But overall, the plot to this game is very similar to Zelda, Hydlide, and Dragon Quest. You need to mostly roam around, fight monsters, build experience, and then occasionally find some sort of item which is necessary to proceed further in the game. Another RPG-esque thing that was not found in Zelda but is found in this game is the use of magic. You have both offensive and healing spells. For example, you can throw fireballs, you can also cast heal on yourself. Unfortunately, the heal spell is not nearly as effective as you would hope. Now, despite all these ideas being borrowed from existing games, Valkyrie no Bouken does introduce a few new things, at least things that were not found in Zelda or in earlier console RPGs. For example, the boat. Later Dragon Quest games would use a ship, but there was certainly nothing like this in the first one. Zelda had a little raft, but you couldn't really use that to explore around the ocean freely like you can in this game. Something that would find its way into Final Fantasy game was tents that would restore both your health and your magic. Unfortunately, these tend to be very rare in the game. You can't just stock up on tents like you can in Final Fantasy. Something else that would turn up in Final Fantasy and later Dragon Quest games was negative character statuses that last beyond just the battle that you're fighting. In this game you can actually be poisoned, both by enemies and by touching things like cactuses. You need to use the poison antidote in order to cure this, otherwise your health will very quickly drain away. Obviously, negative statuses become a very big factor in later RPGs. As you just saw there are little warp gates around the world you can use as kind of shortcuts. Again, in later Dragon Quest games we have something very similar. Another way that Valkyrie differs from Zelda and prior RPGs was the fact that there's absolutely no hints whatsoever in this game. In fact, there's absolutely no dialogue. There's hardly any text at all, but at no point will you run into any little helpful NPCs that'll give you helpful hints as to where you're going. There's really no NPCs at all other than the guys you see running the shops. And this leads into my next point, which is this game is needlessly difficult and frustrating. I certainly wasn't able to finish this game. I was able to finish Hydlide, amazingly enough, but this game proved too much even for me. I leveled up quite a bit, but still found myself being killed when I actually tried to enter a dungeon. Much of the problem seems to be the lack of balance between how much damage you can take and how much you can heal yourself. The monsters in here seem to do about 1/5 of your life bar every time you get hit by a fireball. Your healing spell can restore about 1/5 of your life bar. Unfortunately, it uses so much magic you can only use it 3 times. Additionally, the healing potions only restore a tiny bit of your life. Because inventory space is so limited, you can only carry 8 items, you really aren't able to stock up on healing potions before you enter a dungeon. Whereas Zelda would have monsters that would sometimes drop hearts or even fairies, and Hydlide you were able to generate your health by standing still, there's nothing like it in this game. When you enter a dungeon, you really are going to have to basically simply avoid being hit by monsters. Difficult when they're sending all those fireballs at you. Furthermore, unlike Zelda, Hydlide, and Dragon Quest, there's no way to completely heal up for free. You can stand it in, but it's absurdly expensive by console RPG standards. In Dragon Quest, killing 1 or 2 monsters would usually generate enough gold to stay at an inn. In this game, it costs you around 1 gold piece to generate 1 unit of health, and you usually, well at this point I think I have around 130 hit points so far. Most of the monsters only drop between 1 and 10 gold pieces when you kill them. Let's say an average of around 5. So a lot of times you'll go into battle, get beat up, and come out with only around maybe 50 or 60 gold pieces. I often found myself with not enough gold to actually heal up completely, much less buy better items at shops. I guess the only way to play this game is to either keep leveling up until you get even into the first dungeon, or simply become so good at avoiding enemy fireballs that you can fight monsters without taking any damage. Either way, I was not really having much luck at this game. So I guess I'm going to have to say the lack of balance in this game makes it pretty much unplayable, aside from just being boring. Naturally, this game was a big hit in Japan, and spawned several sequels, which are better than this. So I guess in the long run, this game is a lot like Hydlide. While it's very fascinating to look at the game and chart sort of the progress of console RPGs, it's not much fun to actually play it. Our last game this episode is the big one, Metroid, and this game starts off with some of the best ever music for the Famicom. I have to admit the Japanese title screen is probably a bit cooler than the Western one, and you can save your game too. Here's the Western version for the NES. It uses passwords rather than a game save. For those of you who have never played Metroid, it is one of the great games of the 8-bit Nintendo. It's basically a side-scrolling platformer. You run, jump, shoot enemies, but there is a sense of exploration as per Zelda. The plot of Metroid is actually quite similar to the movie Aliens. You play Samus Aran, a space hunter, whose job it is to beam down to this strange planet and wipe out a race of dangerous aliens called Metroids. One of the first things you'll notice when you start playing the game is you'll probably run into a dead end pretty quickly. In order to get past that wall, you'll need to obtain the first power-up in the game, which is actually found to the immediate left of where you started. This sort of sets up the basic pattern of the game. You explore until you can't anymore, and then you need to find some way of getting past the various barriers that keep you from getting further. So the game structure is somewhat similar to Zelda in the sense of needing to find special items in order to complete the game. This first power-up here will allow you to transform yourself into a little ball and roll underneath various obstacles like that very first one. After you've taken care of this, you'll still find that various doors are locked. In order to get past them, you need to find the missiles and actually blow the doors up. Blue doors can be opened by a single shot with your blaster, but red doors require 5 missiles in order to open them. Additionally, you need to find health tanks that increase your maximum hit points, as well as better weapons. Of course, some of the weapons, such as the Ice Beam, actually serve a dual purpose. Not only are these useful against enemies, but you actually need them to get to certain parts in the game. Still, like pretty much all interesting video games, Metroid did have some predecessors. Like, for example, this game seems very similar to the old Atari 2600 Pitfall 2 game. Like Metroid, Pitfall 2 had both horizontal and vertical scrolling and had a huge cavern to explore. Additionally, there were some items to collect, like the Mountain Lion Quick Claw, that you could see early on in the game but you couldn't get to until much later. Metroid takes these ideas much further than Pitfall 2, but the basic ideas were already present in Pitfall 2. Oddly, this game was really not that old. It was released in 1984, only 2 years before Metroid. Still, when Metroid came out, the vertical scrolling did seem pretty novel at the time. You have these sort of very long, tall, vertical corridors that you have to go up and down. It was almost sort of like taking Super Mario Bros. And adding an extra dimension to it, that of height as well as distance. Additionally, Metroid has no real stages. It's more or less one continuous, seamless whole. Thus, Metroid, more than Super Mario Bros., it gives you the feeling that you're actually sort of exploring an actual concrete developed world. There are several different sections in Metroid which are actually accessed using elevators. But these don't really feel like discrete levels because you do have to go back and forth between the different sections all the time. Another thing that Metroid utilized quite a bit, just like Zelda, was the idea of backtracking. Also, from Zelda, we have the idea that there's countless secrets to be found in the game. Once you obtain the bombs, you're able to bomb your way through hidden passages in floors and walls. Some of these are necessary to progress in the game, whereas others are simply shortcuts. Much of the time spent playing Metroid will be spent wandering around this world looking for ways to get past the various obstacles. And despite the fact that there is a lot of exploration involved, Metroid isn't really a non-linear game. You do have to accomplish things in a certain order in order to make any progress. Like right now, for example, I'm looking to get the high jump boots. This will allow me to jump a little bit further up, and therefore access areas I couldn't have earlier. Until I've got these boots, there are other important objects that I can't get, and a lot of areas that I can't actually get to. So Metroid actually does impose a certain sort of linearity upon the player, though it often doesn't really feel that way when you're playing it. Metroid actually does require you to be pretty clever when going around this place. It is pretty large and it's very easy to get lost, and a lot of the secret passages are really not that easy to find. Here, for example, I'm bombing my way through a shortcut to a new area. Unlike Super Mario Bros. And Zelda, Metroid is not a Shigeru Miyamoto game. It was actually designed by Gunpei Yokoi, the legendary Nintendo employee who also designed the Game Boy. The co-designer of the game was a younger designer named Yoshio Sakamoto. Sakamoto is probably the real creative force behind the Metroid games, and he would actually design most of the later Metroid games. And Metroid definitely is a well-designed game. The color scheme is great, considering the Famicom's limited color palette. A lot of games seem to have sort of ugly, garish color schemes, but definitely not Metroid, and I think the sort of pure black background actually does help a lot. And unlike most prior Nintendo games, the character of Samus is sort of designed in a more or less realistic proportion. Samus sort of looks and moves like a real human being, as opposed to the short, stubby characters of Mario and Zelda. Metroid is really one of the earlier attempts on the Famicom to sort of portray a human being in a semi-realistic fashion, and the music by Hip Tanaka is superb throughout. Another great thing about the game is that even though you have to get items in order to proceed, there really aren't any generic quest-type items like keys. Everything you obtain has an actual purpose to it, other than just unlocking a door. The missiles will help you get through doors, but they're also very good for fighting enemies. These aren't things you just sort of use once and then never have to worry about again. Now here we're coming up to the first boss, and he's actually quite simple. You can sort of stand right in front of him and sort of blast away using either your missiles or your regular gun. You have to defeat two sub-bosses, Ridley and Kraid, and then you can move on to the last level and fight the main boss, the Mother Brain. Once you've defeated Ridley, you actually get a much higher rocket storage capacity, so there is actually an advantage obtained by defeating the bosses. I can now carry up to 99 rockets, which is quite helpful because some of these purple doors actually take 10 rockets to open, and some of the tougher enemies will actually take several rockets to be killed. So again, this game does have a certain debt to Zelda, with your main goal to sort of find the boss and kill them, and your goal before that to be sort of to get powerful enough to actually stand a chance of defeating the boss. In Metroid, this is mostly done by collecting health containers. You can get up to, I believe, well, in this case I have about 500 health points, and I can now hold 200 rockets. So I'm now ready to take on the actual Metroids themselves, which are found at sort of the last, relatively short level of the game. These final few passages are actually the most difficult in the game. The Metroids are a bit tricky. You have to use your ice beam to freeze them, and you can blow them up with a rocket if you want, but that probably just really wastes rockets. It's better probably to simply freeze them and then jump over them. Finally, after dodging lots of lasers and those little red fire circles, you'll meet the Mother Brain herself. She doesn't actually fire at you, but it is difficult to find a place to stand and get a shot at her. You have to fire missiles at her until she explodes. Those little fire rings and lasers make life pretty difficult for you. If I do have one complaint about Metroid, it's the fact that when you get knocked off into a pool of lava, it's actually very difficult to jump out for some reason. Almost every single time I die in this game is because I've been fallen into a pool of lava. If you fall into that little pit of lava right in front of Mother Brain, you're pretty much doomed. Okay, I'm now firing off the last few shots, and Mother Brain is about ready to blow up here. But there's an additional little touch. You have to now get out of the base before it explodes. There's a timer going off, and you have to sort of jump up a bunch of little difficult to navigate platforms and get out safely. And Metroid may be one of the very first games to offer multiple endings. Depending on how fast you finish the game will depend on which ending you get. If you get to the game in a reasonable amount of time, Samus will remove the helmet and reveal that she is in fact a woman. However, if you complete the game very quickly, she'll actually strip down to sort of like a bikini. This is an interesting idea, using sex to reward a gamer for good gameplay. Certainly not the last time this would be done. And the whole idea that your character was actually a female was sort of like the big surprise ending at the time, though of course nowadays it's commonly known. Additionally, if you play through the game again, you'll play Samus, but this time it's sort of like a leotard suit as opposed to her actual spacesuit. So once you finish the game, you get a rather lengthy credits, again with a lot of strange pseudonyms used for the programmers. So what was the overall legacy of Metroid? Well, it helped popularize science fiction themes and platformers. Most platformers at this point had sort of been having cute little fantasy or historical Japanese themes. It helped popularize the concepts of sort of a free-roaming world, backtracking, and a certain amount of non-linearity. And really nothing in Metroid was new, per se, but this game certainly took all these elements together and packaged them in a very appealing way. So once again, Metroid, one of the all-time great games for the Famicom. Well, that's it for Chrontendo Episode 9. In summary, we had some interesting games here, a really great shooter, one of the first RPG-esque Zelda clones. More and more Super Mario Brothers type games are starting to appear. We had a few puzzle games, and we had one of the all-time great releases, Metroid. How did this episode stack up in terms of shoot-em-ups and ninjas? Well, obviously right away we had two shoot-em-ups, B-Wings and the Great Star Soldier. And once again, ninjas reared their head with Toukaidou and Ganbare Goemon. So yeah, I guess this episode did in fact pass our ninja shoot-em-up theory. Hope you'll join us for the next episode of Chrontendo. Has a lot of interesting games, including some early games from SNK and Squaresoft. Thanks a lot, see you then.